Welcome to Javel Stories. Before we continue with the story, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell to always get notified for upcoming stories, and also share the story with loved ones and friends. Thank you very much. Brian Harper sat on the terrace of his sprawling estate, the sun setting behind the horizon, casting a golden hue over the manicured lawns. At 65, Brian was an enigma, a billionaire who shunned the limelight. He was the mastermind behind Harper Oil and Energy, one of the largest oil companies in the world. Yet, remarkably, no one in his company truly knew who he was. Brian's secretive lifestyle wasn't born out of fear or vanity, it was deliberate. Over the years, he had grown disillusioned with the superficial adulation wealth attracted. His name might have been whispered in business circles, but his face was unknown to even the most senior employees in his company. Only Mike, his childhood friend and trusted confidant, knew the truth. The estate, while lavish, felt empty. Its vast halls echoed with silence, a stark contrast to the bustling energy of the corporate world he commanded. Despite his fortune, Brian's personal life was devoid of the joys many took for granted: no children, no family. His wealth was both a blessing and a burden, a stark reminder of the legacy he had yet to define. As he sipped his evening tea, his thoughts turned to Harper Oil and Energy. The company was a testament to his hard work and vision, but cracks had begun to form. Whispers of corruption within the recruitment system had reached his ears. Stories of bribes, favoritism, and unqualified individuals securing vital roles plagued his mind. The thought that his company, built on principles of integrity and excellence, was succumbing to greed infuriated him. Mike, ever the pragmatist, had suggested they investigate discreetly. "We need to see the rot from the inside," Mike had said, leaning forward in the leather armchair opposite Brian. "It's the only way to fix it." Brian agreed, but how? The solution came to him unexpectedly one evening as he observed a beggar outside the company gates. The man, clothed in rags, was invisible to most employees. Few stopped to help, many sneered or hurried past. It was a microcosm of the problem. People judged by appearance and status rather than merit. A plan began to take shape. Brian would disguise himself as a beggar, infiltrating his own company to observe its true nature. It was unconventional, even risky, but Brian thrived on challenges. His wealth had afforded him comfort, but it was his instincts and daring that had built his empire. That night, as he stood by the window of his study, Brian made up his mind. He would expose the corruption in his company, not as a billionaire CEO, but as a nameless man in tattered clothes. The world respected his business acumen, but this time he would test their humanity. "Let them show me who they truly are," he murmured to himself. A flicker of resolve crossed his face. Tomorrow, Harper Oil and Energy would face its first real audit, not of numbers, but of hearts. The next morning, Brian Harper sat at the grand mahogany desk in his study, sketching out the details of his plan. The room, filled with artifacts from his travels and shelves lined with leather-bound books, was his sanctuary. But today, it felt more like a war room. He and Mike had agreed to infiltrate the recruitment process of Harper Oil and Energy. Their mission: expose the flaws and corruption that had seeped into the very fabric of the company. Mike, his lifelong friend and closest confidant, arrived punctually, a folder in hand. "I've done some digging," Mike said, placing the folder on the desk. Inside were reports and complaints from employees, anonymous emails, whispers of favoritism, and allegations of bribes. The evidence was damning. Brian leaned back in his chair, his steely gray eyes scanning the documents. "We've built this company on principles of fairness and integrity," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "And this is what it's come to?" Mike nodded solemnly. "The problem starts at recruitment. People with connections or money are slipping through the cracks, while those with true talent are overlooked. We need to address this, Brian." Brian's mind raced. Harper Oil wasn't just a business to him, it was a legacy. Every decision, every partnership had been meticulously planned, but if corruption was allowed to fester, everything he'd built would crumble. "We'll fix it," he said with conviction. "But we need to approach this differently. What do you have in mind? Mike asked, intrigued. I'll go undercover, Brian said, his lips curving into a faint smile. As a beggar. Mike raised an eyebrow. A beggar? Brian, are you serious? Think about it, Brian replied, leaning forward. Who better to test the integrity of our people than someone they perceive as powerless? If I walk into that company in rags, I'll see who truly has character and who doesn't. Mike considered this. It's risky, but it could work. The recruitment team has interviews scheduled for this week. If you pose as a beggar outside the company gates, you can observe how people treat you. Then, you'll join the applicants inside to see how the process unfolds. Exactly, Brian said, nodding. And I want to be there when they're interviewed. Let's see how our team handles real talent versus influence. Mike smirked. You've always had a flair for the dramatic. I'll coordinate the logistics, but you'll need a convincing disguise. Brian chuckled. Leave that to me. That evening, Brian rummaged through his closets, searching for the oldest, most worn-out clothes he could find. He smeared dirt on his face and practiced slouching to hide his tall, commanding frame. By the time he looked in the mirror, he was unrecognizable, a ragged man with disheveled hair and sunken eyes. The plan was set. Tomorrow, Harper Oil and Energy wouldn't see its CEO, it would see a beggar. As Brian lay in bed that night, his mind buzzed with anticipation. He wasn't just testing his company, he was testing humanity itself. The question wasn't just who would get the job, but who truly deserved it. The morning air was crisp as Brian Harper approached the towering gates of Harper Oil and Energy. Dressed in tattered clothes, with a scruffy beard he had glued on and a cap pulled low over his forehead, he looked every bit the part of a beggar. His normally confident stride was replaced with a hesitant shuffle, and his tall, broad frame was hunched to make him appear smaller. As the city hummed with life around him, Brian positioned himself near the main entrance. Employees began to stream in, sharply dressed in suits and carrying briefcases. They barely spared him a glance. The sight of a man begging outside the gates of their prestigious company seemed to make them uncomfortable. Some quickened their pace, others crossed to the opposite side of the street. Brian held a small tin cup in his hand, shaking it slightly to make the coins inside clink. "Spare some change, please," he murmured, keeping his voice low and shaky. For the first hour, he was invisible. Dozens of employees walked past, chatting on phones, scrolling through emails, or exchanging pleasantries with colleagues. Not a single one stopped. Finally, a middle-aged man wearing a janitor's uniform paused. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins, dropping them into Brian's cup. "Here you go, sir," the man said with a kind smile. "It's not much, but I hope it helps." "Thank you," Brian said, his voice genuine. He made a mental note of the man's name tag, Luis. As the morning wore on, Brian continued his quiet observation. A woman carrying a stack of papers hurried by, but paused briefly to hand him a dollar bill before rushing inside. Another young intern looked at him with pity, but offered nothing. It was a stark contrast to the indifference shown by most. Around mid-morning, a sleek black car pulled up to the gates, and a young man stepped out. Eric. He was dressed in an expensive tailored suit, his watch gleaming in the sunlight. He didn't even glance at Brian as he strode past, a look of self-importance plastered across his face. Minutes later, Samuel arrived. Unlike Eric, he did notice Brian, but his reaction was far from kind. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his tone sharp. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a $5 bill, and tossed it at Brian. "Here, now leave. This isn't a shelter." Brian nodded, hiding his growing frustration. Samuel's condescension was worse than indifference. As the last applicant, a young woman, approached, Brian straightened slightly. Felicia. Her clothes were modest but neat, and her eyes carried a mix of determination and exhaustion. She stopped in front of him, hesitating. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked softly. "I'm fine," Brian replied. "Just trying to get by." Felicia frowned, glancing toward the entrance. "You shouldn't have to do this. Let me see if I have something." She dug into her bag, pulling out a few crumpled bills, and placed them in his cup. "Take care of yourself, okay?" Brian watched her walk away, a small smile tugging at his lips. Amid the apathy and arrogance, here was someone who still cared. As the morning ended, Brian knew he had already learned a great deal about the people he would soon face inside. It was time for the next phase of his plan. Inside the waiting room of Harper Oil and Energy, Samuel adjusted the cuffs of his crisp navy blue suit. The room, adorned with modern furniture and abstract artwork, was meant to impress. But Samuel was already confident. He didn't need the atmosphere to feel important. With his academic distinctions and polished demeanor, he believed the position was practically his. Samuel had always been ambitious. As a young boy, he excelled in school, quickly earning the reputation of a prodigy. By the time he graduated, his resume boasted achievements that most people could only dream of. Top of his class, internships at prestigious firms, and a degree from an Ivy League school, all markers of a future leader. But his confidence often came across as arrogance. Samuel rarely acknowledged those he deemed beneath him. He viewed life as a competition, and he was determined to be the winner. This interview was no different. As he sat in the plush leather chair, Samuel glanced at the other applicants and smirked. A young man in an overly flashy suit sat to his left, scrolling on his phone with an air of entitlement. To his right, a woman with a worn-out bag clutched her resume nervously. Samuel barely gave her a second glance. Unprepared, he thought. She doesn't belong here. Samuel's thoughts were interrupted when the receptionist entered, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Excuse me, candidates," she announced. "Please ensure you have all your documents ready. The panel will see you shortly." Samuel gave a curt nod, pulling out his portfolio. It was a perfectly arranged binder, complete with his certificates, recommendation letters, and a glowing letter of intent. He glanced at the woman next to him, Felicia, he remembered hearing, and noticed her fumbling with a folder. Papers spilled onto the floor, and she hurried to gather them. Rolling his eyes, Samuel leaned back in his chair. "Some people just don't prepare," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. Felicia's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. Then the door opened, and a disheveled man in tattered clothes stepped inside. Brian, still in disguise, shuffled to a chair and sat down. The room went silent as the applicants turned to stare. "What on earth?" Samuel muttered, wrinkling his nose. Eric, the flashy young man, immediately stood and whispered to the receptionist, gesturing toward Brian. The receptionist looked uncomfortable, but nodded. Meanwhile, Samuel decided to take matters into his own hands. "This isn't a shelter," Samuel said sharply, addressing Brian. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $5 bill, and tossed it at him. "Take this and leave. You're embarrassing yourself." Brian didn't respond, merely staring at the young man with a calm, measured gaze. Samuel crossed his arms, satisfied with himself. "Some people," he muttered, shaking his head. As the receptionist approached Brian, Samuel leaned back, confident that his actions had solidified his place as the most professional candidate in the room. In his mind, he had already won. Eric leaned back in his chair, twirling his phone between his fingers as he scrolled through his messages. The faint scent of his cologne filled the air, strong and extravagant, much like the man himself. Dressed in a tailored suit that likely cost more than the average salary of most employees in the building, Eric exuded entitlement. To him, this interview was a mere formality. He wasn't here to prove himself, he was here to claim what he already believed was his. Dad's already spoken to the board, Eric thought smugly. His father, a prominent businessman with connections spanning the industry, had made it clear that Eric's selection was a certainty. "You'll be a great fit," his father had said. "Just show up, smile, and they'll hand you the job." Eric's phone buzzed with a message from a friend. "How's the interview? LOL. He smirked as he typed back. "Easy, just a matter of time before I'm in." The waiting room wasn't particularly impressive to Eric, though he couldn't help but glance at the artwork on the walls. Probably overpriced nonsense, he thought. The other applicants barely registered in his mind. Samuel, with his meticulous appearance, was clearly trying too hard. And the woman, what was her name? Felicia, looked like she'd stepped out of a thrift store. Eric scoffed at the thought of either of them being competition. The door opened, and a man dressed in rags entered the room. Eric's brows furrowed as he watched the figure shuffle to a chair and sit down. Is this some kind of joke? He muttered, looking over at the receptionist. The air in the room grew tense as the beggar, Brian in disguise, sat silently, his head bowed slightly. Eric stood abruptly, his polished leather shoes clicking against the floor. "Excuse me," he called out to the receptionist. "Can we do something about this?" He gestured toward Brian dismissively. "This is an office, not a charity." The receptionist hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but Eric pressed on. "Seriously, he's making the place look bad. Just handle it." He waved his hand as if swatting away a fly. Samuel, not to be outdone, chimed in, "Exactly. He doesn't belong here." Eric smirked at the validation, turning back to his phone as if the matter were already resolved. But then Felicia spoke up, her voice steady despite the nervousness in her expression. "He's not hurting anyone," she said. "He has as much right to be here as any of us. We don't know his story." Eric raised an eyebrow, his smirk fading. "Are you serious? Look at him." He motioned to Brian's tattered clothes. "This is a professional environment. We're here for an executive role, not a charity case." Felicia opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the receptionist approached Brian hesitantly. "Sir, I'm sorry, but you can't stay here," she said, her tone apologetic but firm. Eric crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied grin as Brian was escorted out. "Good riddance," he muttered under his breath. Eric's phone buzzed again. "Update," his friend texted. He replied quickly, "Handled. Now, just waiting for my turn." This is too easy. For Eric, the world revolved around connections, power, and appearance. He believed those qualities guaranteed success, but he would soon learn that his arrogance was about to cost him everything. Felicia sat nervously in the waiting room, her fingers gripping the edges of the folder that contained her resume. Her dark brown eyes darted between the other candidates, both of whom exuded confidence and self-assurance. She felt out of place in her second-hand blazer, which was slightly too large for her slim frame. The cuffs of her white shirt were frayed, but it was the best she could afford. Felicia had never imagined herself here, sitting in the offices of one of the largest oil companies in the country, waiting to interview for a role that could change her life. The stakes were unimaginably high. Her mother had been ill for months, and the medical bills were piling up. This job wasn't just an opportunity, it was her lifeline. She glanced at the wall clock. The ticking sound seemed louder with every passing second. Her thoughts drifted to her mother, who had encouraged her to apply. "You're smart, Felicia," her mother had said, holding her hand. "Don't let anyone make you think you're not good enough." But sitting next to Samuel, who looked like he had stepped out of a corporate magazine, and Eric, whose air of entitlement was palpable, Felicia felt small. They had every advantage she didn't: money, connections, and confidence. Yet, she reminded herself of her mother's words. "I've worked hard," she thought. "I deserve to be here." Her focus shifted when the door opened, and an older man dressed in tattered clothes entered. Felicia watched as he hesitated, then shuffled to a chair at the far end of the room. The man looked tired, his clothes dirty and his hands rough. Felicia's heart tightened. She knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be judged for your appearance rather than your worth. Eric's reaction was immediate. He stood, motioning to the receptionist and demanding that the man be removed. Samuel, not wanting to be left behind, joined in, offering the man money to leave. Felicia felt a surge of anger rise within her. How could they be so cruel? "Excuse me," Felicia said, her voice cutting through the tension. Both Eric and Samuel turned to look at her, their expressions incredulous. "What?" Eric asked, raising an eyebrow. "He's not doing anything wrong," Felicia said, standing her ground. Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed through. "He has every right to be here." Eric scoffed. "Are you serious? Look at him." "I am serious," Felicia replied, her tone firm now. "Clothes don't determine a person's worth. For all we know, he's here for the same reason we are." Samuel rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath, but Felicia ignored him. She turned to the receptionist, who looked torn. "Please," she said, her voice softening. "He's not hurting anyone." The receptionist hesitated, but ultimately sided with Eric and Samuel, asking the man to leave. Felicia's heart sank as she watched him shuffle out, his shoulders hunched. As silence returned to the room, Felicia sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. She could feel Eric and Samuel's judgmental gazes on her, but she didn't care. She had done the right thing, and deep down, she hoped that someday doing the right thing would matter. The waiting room felt colder after the commotion. Felicia sat quietly, her heart still pounding from her confrontation with Eric and Samuel. She stared at the scuffed floor, gripping her folder tightly, trying to shake off the sinking feeling in her chest. The man they had dismissed, he didn't deserve the treatment he'd received. She wondered where he'd gone and if he was okay. Eric reclined in his chair, scrolling through his phone as though nothing had happened. Samuel, meanwhile, adjusted his tie, giving Felicia a smug glance as if her defense of the beggar was nothing more than a childish outburst. The receptionist returned to the desk, visibly uncomfortable. She avoided Felicia's gaze and resumed typing on her computer. The tension in the room was palpable. Just as the candidates began to settle back into the uneasy silence, the door creaked open again. Felicia looked up, her eyes widening in disbelief. The man they had just kicked out, the beggar, had returned. This time, however, he wasn't escorted by security. He walked back into the room as if he belonged there. Eric groaned audibly. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, throwing a disbelieving glance at Samuel, who rolled his eyes. "What is wrong with this guy?" Brian, still dressed in his tattered disguise, shuffled over to an empty chair and sat down, his movements slow and deliberate. His expression was calm, almost serene, as though he hadn't just been humiliated moments ago. He placed a worn-out bag beside him and folded his hands in his lap. Felicia glanced nervously between the man and the others, wondering what would happen next. Eric immediately stood, his face reddening with indignation. "Didn't we already deal with this?" he snapped, turning to the receptionist. "Why is he back here? Are we just letting anyone in now?" The receptionist hesitated, clearly flustered. "Sir, I'll call security again." "No," Felicia said sharply, surprising even herself. She stood up, clutching her folder tightly. "He has every right to be here." Eric scoffed. "Here we go again. What is it with you and this guy?" "Maybe I just believe people should be treated with respect," Felicia shot back. Her voice was shaking, but her resolve was steady. She turned to the receptionist. "You don't know why he's here. None of us do. Maybe he's an applicant like the rest of us?" Samuel snorted. "Be serious. Look at him." Felicia turned her fiery gaze to Samuel. "What if someone judged you based on your worst day? Would you want them to dismiss you without a chance to prove yourself?" For a moment, no one spoke. The receptionist looked between the applicants, her expression conflicted. Eric sighed dramatically, waving his hand. "Fine, let him sit here. But don't blame me when this circus costs us time." Felicia sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. She could feel the hostility radiating from Eric and Samuel, but she refused to back down. The beggar, Brian, remained quiet, his eyes scanning the room as if taking in every detail. What Felicia didn't know was that her words and actions had already set her apart, and in the eyes of the man they all underestimated, her kindness had not gone unnoticed. The tension in the waiting room was palpable as the receptionist finally called for the interviews to begin. She looked uneasy as her eyes darted to Brian, still sitting quietly in his tattered clothes. Her voice faltered slightly as she announced, "Samuel, you're up first. Please follow me." Samuel rose confidently, smoothing down his suit as he walked past the others. He spared Brian a dismissive glance and gave Felicia a smug smirk before striding through the door into the interview room. Inside, a panel of 3 executives sat at a polished oak table, their expressions neutral but watchful. Each held a copy of Samuel's impeccable resume. They greeted him politely as he took his seat, flashing them a charming smile. "Thank you for this opportunity," Samuel began, his tone smooth and practiced. "I'm confident my academic achievements and leadership experience will make me a valuable asset to Harper Oil." The executives nodded, asking him a series of questions about his background, his understanding of the company's values, and his vision for the role. Samuel answered confidently, leaning heavily on his academic credentials and emphasizing his ability to lead teams effectively. However, as the interview progressed, his arrogance began to seep through. When asked about teamwork, he focused on his ability to take charge and ensure others followed his direction. When asked how he'd handle conflict in the workplace, he dismissed the idea of compromise, stating, "Sometimes people just need to listen to the one who knows best." By the end of the interview, the panel exchanged subtle glances. Samuel's credentials were impressive, but his overconfidence left a bitter taste. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," the lead executive said, standing to signal the end of the interview. "We'll be in touch." Samuel smiled and shook their hands, oblivious to their lukewarm reception. As he walked out, he shot a triumphant glance at the others in the waiting room. "Good luck," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe they'd need it. The receptionist called next for Eric. He sauntered into the interview room, exuding confidence and entitlement. Unlike Samuel, Eric didn't bother hiding his belief that the job was already his. "My father has spoken highly of Harper Oil," he began, leaning back in his chair as if he were already part of the team. "I've grown up in a business environment, so I understand how things work. I'm sure I can bring fresh perspectives to this role." The panel asked him the same questions, but Eric's answers were vague and peppered with mentions of his father's influence. When asked how he would contribute to the company's culture, Eric shrugged. "I'm adaptable. I'll fit in wherever you need me." The executive's expressions grew colder with each answer. By the time Eric left the room, their decision was already made. When Felicia was called next, she hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched her folder. As she passed Brian, still in his disguise, he gave her a small, encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Felicia entered the room, determined to make her case. Felicia stepped into the interview room, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls seemed to close in on her, but she forced herself to keep moving. The panel of 3 executives sat before her, their faces unreadable. She clutched her worn folder tightly, hoping they wouldn't notice the frayed edges. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Good morning, Miss Collins," said the lead interviewer, a sharp-eyed woman with an air of authority. "Please take a seat." Felicia sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her stomach churned with nerves, but she reminded herself why she was here, why she needed this job. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, pale and weary, lying in a hospital bed. That image alone gave her strength. "Let's start with your background," one of the executives said, flipping through her resume. "Tell us about your education and any relevant experience." Felicia nodded, her voice steadying as she began. "I recently graduated with a degree in business administration. While in school, I worked part-time at a small logistics company to help support my family. My responsibilities included inventory management and coordinating deliveries, which taught me how to handle multiple tasks under pressure." The panel listened intently, their pens scratching against paper as they took notes. "And what do you know about Harper Oil?" the lead interviewer asked, leaning forward. Felicia straightened her posture, her confidence growing. "Harper Oil is one of the most respected energy companies in the world, known for innovation and corporate responsibility. I admire how the company has balanced profitability with initiatives to support communities and protect the environment. That's something I'd be proud to contribute to." The panel exchanged glances, impressed by her preparation. "Impressive," said one of the interviewers, "but this role requires leadership. Can you give us an example of a time you demonstrated leadership?" Felicia hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "During my final year of college, I led a team project for our capstone course. The assignment was to develop a business plan for a startup, and our team faced multiple challenges, including disagreements on the direction of the project. I facilitated discussions, ensuring everyone's ideas were heard, and ultimately brought the team together to create a plan we were all proud of. We earned the highest grade in the class." The interviewers nodded, scribbling notes. Felicia noticed their expressions softening, their initial skepticism fading. "And what would you say is your greatest strength?" the sharp-eyed woman asked. "Resilience," Felicia replied without hesitation. "No matter how difficult things get, I find a way to push through. I don't give up." Her answer was simple but powerful. The panel seemed to sit back, considering her words. Finally, the lead interviewer smiled faintly. Thank you, Miss Collins. That will be all for now. We'll be in touch. Felicia stood, thanking them politely before leaving the room. As she stepped into the waiting area, she felt a flicker of hope. She had given it her all, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that it might be enough. As she sat back down, she caught the eye of the man in rags, Brian. He gave her a small, approving nod, and she returned it with a faint smile. Little did she know that the most important part of her journey was just beginning. The waiting room fell into silence after Felicia returned from her interview. She sat down carefully, still clutching her folder, her thoughts racing. Eric and Samuel barely acknowledged her, both confident in their own performances. Meanwhile, Brian, still dressed as a beggar, watched them closely, his calm demeanor hiding the storm of thoughts brewing in his mind. Moments later, the receptionist entered the room, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for your patience," she announced. "The recruitment team will deliberate and we'll call you back shortly." Eric leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Deliberate all you want," he muttered under his breath. "This job is mine." Samuel smirked but said nothing, while Felicia sat quietly, her nerves mounting again. Brian stood, stretching slightly, and began walking toward the door. Eric rolled his eyes. "Finally, he's leaving," he muttered. But instead of heading for the exit, Brian walked down the corridor, disappearing behind the same doors the candidates had entered for their interviews. Eric sat up straighter, his expression confused. "What's he doing back there?" Felicia glanced at the door Brian had entered, her brows furrowing. Something about the man had felt different from the moment she saw him. Her curiosity outweighed her anxiety. Inside the interview room, the recruitment panel was gathered, murmuring to each other as they reviewed the candidates' profiles. The atmosphere shifted instantly when Brian entered, still wearing his tattered disguise. The executives froze, their eyes widening as they recognized the man before them. "Mr. Harper," the lead interviewer gasped, standing abruptly. What are you?" Brian raised a hand to silence her. "Please sit," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to address some very serious concerns." The panel exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. Brian walked to the front of the room and slowly removed his cap. He straightened his posture, towering over the table, and wiped away the smudges of dirt from his face. The transformation was immediate. The disheveled beggar was gone, replaced by the commanding presence of Brian Harper, the CEO of Harper Oil and Energy. "You've all done an excellent job of keeping my identity a secret," he began, his tone measured but sharp. "But today, I've come to see the true nature of this company, the nature of the people within it." The panel shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I've spent the past few hours as an observer," Brian continued, pacing slowly. "Not just of the candidates, but of this entire process. And what I've seen has been illuminating." He paused, letting his words sink in. The tension in the room was thick, the panel members clearly uncomfortable under his scrutiny. "I'll be calling for a meeting shortly," Brian said, his voice firm. "Gather every candidate and every staff member involved in today's interviews. We'll be addressing the flaws in this process immediately." Without waiting for a response, Brian turned and exited the room, leaving the executives in stunned silence. Outside, he walked back into the waiting area, his transformation startling the candidates. Eric's mouth fell open and Samuel blinked in disbelief. Felicia stared, her mind racing as she pieced together the truth. Brian met her gaze, his eyes calm but piercing. "Miss Collins," he said softly, "please stay seated. This isn't over yet." Brian Harper stood at the center of the conference room, now fully transformed into the commanding figure that no one in the waiting room had suspected. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, a sharp contrast to the rags he'd worn just moments ago. The tension in the room was palpable as employees from the recruitment team and the three candidates, including Felicia, Eric, and Samuel, gathered around. Mike, his trusted friend, stood by his side, his expression serious. It was Mike who had called for this emergency assembly at Brian's command, ensuring that everyone involved in the day's events was present. Eric and Samuel exchanged uneasy glances. The reality of Brian's identity began to sink in, and with it, the gravity of their earlier behavior. Felicia sat quietly, her emotions swirling between confusion and hope. She looked at Brian, the man she had defended earlier, now exuding a level of authority that demanded attention. Brian took a deep breath, surveying the room. His eyes rested briefly on each person before he began to speak. "I'm Brian Harper," he said, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "I'm the CEO of Harper Oil and Energy, though many of you probably didn't know that until now. That was intentional." The room remained silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. "Over the years, I've built this company with the belief that it should stand for more than just profit. Integrity, fairness, and respect for others have always been the principles I hold dear. But recently, I've heard whispers, stories of corruption and favoritism within our recruitment system. And so, I decided to see the truth for myself." He gestured to his loyal friend. "Mike and I devised a plan. I disguised myself as a beggar to test not just the candidates, but also the process itself. What I witnessed today was both enlightening and disappointing." Brian's gaze shifted to the recruitment team seated at the front. "Let's start with the interview process. It was clear to me that decisions were being made not based on merit, but on influence. I observed a candidate, Eric, being favored despite providing vague and uninspired answers. Connections and entitlement seemed to matter more than substance." Eric sank in his chair, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Brian then turned to Samuel. "Mr. Carter, your academic achievements are impressive, but arrogance and condescension are not leadership qualities. Offering a man money to leave instead of treating him with dignity, that speaks volumes about your character." Samuel's face paled, and he looked away, avoiding Brian's piercing stare. Finally, Brian's eyes softened as they landed on Felicia. "Miss Collins," he said gently, "you were the only one who stood up for what was right today. Despite your own challenges, you showed compassion and fairness. That is the kind of character we need in this company." Felicia's breath caught in her throat, her hands gripping the edges of her chair. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Brian straightened, his tone hardening as he addressed the room. "Effective immediately, the recruitment team responsible for today's process is dismissed. Favoritism and corruption have no place here." Gasps rippled through the room as the team members stood, their faces a mixture of shock and shame. "Security," Brian said, turning to the guard station at the door, "please escort Mr. Carter and Mr. Lane off the premises. They are no longer eligible for employment at Harper Oil." Samuel and Eric protested loudly, but their objections fell on deaf ears. As security led them out, Brian turned back to the room, his expression resolute. "This company will not tolerate unethical behavior, not from employees and not from leaders. Change begins today." Brian's final words hung in the air as the dismissed individuals were escorted out. Felicia, still seated, felt a wave of relief and gratitude. Her courage had not gone unnoticed, and for the first time in months, hope bloomed in her heart. The room remained eerily silent after Brian's commanding declaration. The recruitment team had been escorted out, and the door closed behind the disgraced applicants, Samuel and Eric. All eyes turned back to Brian Harper, the man who had just revealed himself as the CEO of Harper Oil and Energy. His presence was magnetic, and his words carried the weight of absolute authority. Felicia sat frozen in her chair, still processing the whirlwind of events. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Had she truly just witnessed two candidates dismissed for their lack of character? Was the CEO, the same man she had defended earlier, about to make a decision that could change her life? Brian turned toward Felicia, his steely gray eyes softening as they met hers. He approached her slowly, his towering frame imposing yet somehow comforting. The other staff and executives in the room watched in anticipation, their curiosity piqued by what was about to unfold. "Miss Collins," Brian began, his voice calm but resolute, "today you showed something that cannot be taught in any classroom or learned through years of experience. You showed compassion, fairness, and courage, qualities that define a true leader." Felicia blinked, her throat tightening with emotion. She opened her mouth to speak, but found herself at a loss for words. Brian continued, his voice growing steadier. "I came here today, not just to observe the flaws in our recruitment process, but to find someone who embodies the values this company stands for. Someone who will not only do the job, but inspire others through their actions. He extended a hand toward her. Miss Collins, I would like to offer you the position you came here to interview for. You've proven yourself more capable than any resume or interview ever could. Felicia's heart stopped for a moment. Her eyes darted around the room as if seeking confirmation that this was real. When her gaze returned to Brian, his expression was unwavering. She stammered, her voice breaking. I don't know what to say. Brian's lips curved into a faint smile. Say yes. Tears welled up in Felicia's eyes as she nodded. Yes, thank you. I won't let you down. The room erupted into applause. Mike, standing to the side, clapped enthusiastically, his pride in both Brian and Felicia evident. The other executives nodded in approval, acknowledging the wisdom of Brian's decision. Brian straightened, addressing the room once more. This moment isn't just about Miss Collins. It's about redefining the culture of this company. From this day forward, Harper Oil will prioritize character, integrity, and merit over connections and appearances. That is how we will remain a leader in this industry. Turning back to Felicia, he added softly, Your journey with us begins today, Miss Collins. Welcome to Harper Oil. Felicia wiped a tear from her cheek, standing shakily as the weight of her struggles began to lift. She extended her hand to Brian, her gratitude overflowing. Thank you, Mr. Harper. This means everything to me. No, Brian replied, shaking her hand firmly. Thank you for reminding me of what truly matters. As Felicia left the conference room, her head held high for the first time in months, she felt a sense of hope and purpose she hadn't known in years. Meanwhile, Brian stood at the center of his company, more determined than ever to ensure it stood as a beacon of fairness and integrity. The following morning, Harper Oil and Energy buzzed with activity. Word of the previous day's events had spread like wildfire. Employees whispered in the hallways about how their elusive CEO, Brian Harper, had not only revealed himself, but also made sweeping changes that shook the company to its core. The dismissal of the recruitment team and 2 high-profile candidates had sent a clear message. The company's culture was changing, and there would be no tolerance for corruption or favoritism. Brian sat in his expansive office on the top floor of the building, the city skyline visible through the large windows behind him. The office was luxurious, but understated, much like the man himself. Mike entered, carrying a stack of documents. You've made quite the impression, Mike said, setting the papers on Brian's desk with a grin. Everyone's talking about yesterday. They should, Brian replied, leaning back in his chair. We've let things slip for too long. It's time to rebuild this company from the ground up, starting with our values. Mike nodded, handing Brian a folder. I've drafted a proposal for restructuring the recruitment process. It includes stricter oversight, mandatory training on ethical practices, and a panel that evaluates candidates based solely on merit. Brian opened the folder, scanning the contents. Good. We'll implement this immediately. No more shortcuts, no more nepotism. Everyone who walks through these doors will have a fair chance. He set the folder aside and sighed. But we need more than policies. We need to show our employees, our entire team, that this isn't just about appearances, it's about action. Mike crossed his arms, leaning against the desk. I couldn't agree more. Any ideas? Brian's eyes glinted with determination. I want to meet with every department head. I want to hear their concerns, their suggestions, and their experiences. We can't fix the culture of this company if we don't understand it first. Mike nodded. I'll schedule the meetings. And one more thing, Brian added. I want Felicia involved in these reforms. She's new, yes, but she brings a perspective we need. Someone who understands what it means to fight for an opportunity. Mike raised an eyebrow. You're serious? Dead serious, Brian replied. We can't just promote change from the top. It has to come from every level of this organization. Felicia sat in her new office, still overwhelmed by the whirlwind of events. The space was modest but functional, a far cry from the waiting room where she'd nervously clutched her resume just 24 hours ago. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Come in, she said, her voice tentative. Brian stepped inside, his towering presence filling the room. Felicia stood quickly, unsure whether she should sit or salute. At ease, Brian said with a small smile, gesturing for her to sit. How's your first day? It's a lot to take in, she admitted, her hands clasped tightly on the desk. Brian nodded. I understand, but I need your help with something. Felicia blinked, surprised. My help? Yes, Brian replied. You've already proven you have the courage and integrity we need in this company. I want you to be part of the team that helps reform our recruitment process. Felicia's eyes widened. Me? But I'm just starting. I don't know if you've already shown more leadership than most people here, Brian interrupted gently. I don't need someone with years of experience. I need someone with heart, someone who understands the importance of fairness. Are you in? Felicia hesitated for a moment before nodding firmly. Yes, I'm in. Brian smiled. Good. Welcome to the real work. Felicia sat at the large, oval table in the conference room, feeling both exhilarated and out of place. Around her sat department heads and senior managers, all seasoned professionals with years of experience in the company. At the head of the table was Brian Harper, commanding the room with a quiet intensity. To his right sat Mike, diligently taking notes. The meeting was the first of many designed to address the cultural issues within Harper Oil and Energy. The company was undergoing a transformation, and Felicia had been invited to contribute, a decision that had raised a few eyebrows among the senior staff. Some regarded her with curiosity, others barely hid their skepticism. Before we dive into specifics, Brian began, his voice firm but calm, I want to reiterate why we're here. This company has thrived because of its innovation and hard work, but we've allowed complacency and favoritism to take root. That ends now. He looked around the room, his gaze settling on each person briefly before continuing. We're here to create a culture that values integrity, merit, and fairness above all else. To do that, I need everyone at this table to be fully committed. Felicia listened intently, her heart racing as she prepared to speak for the first time. She had spent the night reviewing company policies and thinking about the changes she wanted to see. When Brian finally opened the floor for input, she hesitated, unsure if she should speak up. Miss Collins, Brian said, breaking the silence and turning to her, you're new to this company, but that's exactly why your perspective matters. What do you think needs to change? Felicia felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself and began. I think the biggest issue isn't just the policies but the mindset. People need to feel that this company values their skills and hard work, not their connections or how they look on paper. She paused, glancing around the table. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked unimpressed. Emboldened, she continued. For example, the recruitment process I experienced yesterday didn't give everyone a fair shot. Decisions were made based on biases rather than merit. We need to create systems that eliminate those biases, like blind evaluations or structured interviews where every candidate gets the same questions. Brian nodded, a faint smile of approval on his face. Good points. And what about support for new employees? Felicia hesitated again. But then the words came naturally. There should be mentoring programs. When someone like me starts at a company this big, it's easy to feel lost. A mentor could help guide new hires and ensure they understand the company's values. Interesting, Mike chimed in, jotting down notes. That could also help foster better relationships across departments. A senior manager, an older man with graying hair, leaned back in his chair and frowned. These ideas sound good in theory, but they'll take time and resources. How do we ensure this doesn't disrupt productivity? Brian's gaze sharpened. Change always requires investment, Mr. Aldridge, and I believe the long-term benefits of a fairer, more motivated workforce will far outweigh any short-term inconveniences. Felicia nodded, her confidence growing. And if employees see that the company is genuinely committed to fairness, it could improve morale and loyalty. That would only help productivity. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Brian spoke again. Thank you, Miss Collins. Your input is exactly the kind of fresh perspective we need. After the meeting, Felicia felt a mix of pride and exhaustion. As she left the conference room, Mike caught up to her. "You did well," he said, smiling warmly. "Not everyone's going to like the changes, but don't let that discourage you." Felicia nodded, determination lighting her eyes. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The reforms began the very next day, and the atmosphere at Harper Oil and energy shifted almost immediately. Brian Harper's bold announcements had sent ripples throughout the company, and while many welcomed the changes, others met them with resistance. As the new systems were introduced, the true depth of the company's culture, both its strengths and flaws, began to surface. Felicia's first task as part of the reform team was to assist in overhauling the recruitment process. She worked closely with Mike, who had become her mentor, and a small group of trusted HR professionals. The new process included structured interviews, anonymous application reviews, and clear guidelines designed to eliminate bias. But it wasn't long before pushback started. Felicia was reviewing a list of proposed interview questions in a smaller conference room when two senior managers, Mr. Aldridge and Ms. Carver, entered unannounced. Their body language was stiff, and their expressions made it clear they were not fans of the reforms. "Miss Collins," Mr. Aldridge began, his tone polite but edged with condescension, "we've been hearing a lot about these changes you're helping to implement. While I'm sure your intentions are good, you might not fully understand how things operate at this level." Felicia straightened in her chair, meeting his gaze. "I understand the need for fairness, Mr. Aldridge. That's why these changes are necessary." Ms. Carver sighed, crossing her arms. "You're new here, and we appreciate your enthusiasm, but there's a reason certain practices have been in place for years. They work." Felicia felt her cheeks flush but kept her voice steady. "With respect, if those practices worked, we wouldn't have had the issues Mr. Harper identified. The goal isn't to do what's comfortable, it's to ensure everyone gets an equal chance, no matter their background." Mr. Aldridge's jaw tightened. "And you believe eliminating experience and connections entirely is the way forward?" "It's not about eliminating experience or connections," Felicia said firmly. "It's about ensuring they're not the only factors that matter. Skills, character, and potential should be equally important." Brian walked into the room just as Felicia finished speaking. His presence immediately silenced the tension. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his calm tone carrying an undertone of authority. Mr. Aldridge hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir, we were just expressing some concerns about the new processes." Brian smiled faintly. "Concerns are welcome. Resistance to progress, however, is not. If you have constructive feedback, my door is always open. Otherwise, I suggest you focus on adapting to these changes." The managers exchanged uneasy glances before excusing themselves. Brian turned to Felicia. "Well handled," he said. "You'll face more resistance, but don't let it discourage you. Remember, meaningful change is rarely easy." Felicia nodded, a surge of determination coursing through her. The first round of recruitment under the new process was a litmus test for the reforms. Felicia and Mike worked tirelessly to ensure the system ran smoothly. Candidates were anonymized during the initial stages, with only their qualifications and skills considered. Structured interviews followed, with each applicant evaluated against a clear rubric. By the end of the week, the team had selected a diverse group of talented individuals. Many came from non-traditional backgrounds, their skills speaking louder than their resumes. The successful candidates were thrilled, expressing gratitude for the fairness of the process. The reforms extended beyond recruitment. Felicia and Brian worked on introducing mentorship programs and workshops on corporate ethics. Employees began to notice the changes. Some embraced them wholeheartedly, while others grumbled in private. Still, the culture of Harper Oil was undeniably evolving. Felicia's contributions did not go unnoticed. Brian often sought her opinion, valuing her fresh perspective and unwavering resolve. Though she faced skepticism from some, she earned the respect of many through her dedication and integrity. As the weeks passed, the reforms began to bear fruit. The company's morale improved and productivity soared. Felicia, once uncertain about her place in the corporate world, found herself thriving in her new role. Still, she knew the journey was far from over. Resistance lingered in the shadows, and the fight for fairness would be an ongoing battle. But with Brian's support and her own growing confidence, she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Weeks turned into months, and Harper Oil and Energy continued its transformation. Felicia found herself at the center of the change, working closely with Brian Harper and Mike to ensure the reforms were not only implemented, but embraced across the company. Her role grew beyond recruitment, and she was soon part of discussions about mentorship programs, workplace ethics, and employee development. Despite her initial nervousness, Felicia began to find her footing. She had grown from a hesitant new hire into a confident and respected voice in the company. Yet, the journey wasn't without its challenges. Felicia's days were long and filled with tasks she had never encountered before. Drafting policy documents, leading meetings, and handling difficult conversations with senior staff were daunting responsibilities. She often stayed late in her modest office, poring over reports and preparing for the next day's challenges. One evening, as she reviewed a proposal for a mentorship initiative, Mike knocked on her open door. "Burning the midnight oil, I see," he said with a grin. Stepping inside, Felicia smiled, though exhaustion was evident in her eyes. "There's just so much to learn. I want to get this right." Mike pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "You're doing more than getting it right, Felicia. You're excelling. I've been here for years, and I've never seen anyone adapt as quickly as you have." Felicia's cheeks flushed with pride. "Thank you, Mike. That means a lot." "Just remember," he added, his tone softening, "you're allowed to make mistakes. Brian trusts you, and so do I. You don't have to have all the answers right away." Felicia nodded, his words reassuring her. She knew she had a lot to prove, but she also understood the importance of pacing herself. Not everyone welcomed Felicia's rise. A few senior employees resented her presence in meetings, questioning why someone so new was given so much responsibility. Felicia noticed the cold stares and overheard the whispers, but she refused to let them discourage her. During one particularly tense meeting about the company's mentorship program, a senior manager named Ms. Carver voiced her skepticism. "While this program looks good on paper, I'm not sure it's worth the resources. We've operated just fine without it." Felicia, seated near Brian, took a deep breath before responding. "I understand your concerns, Ms. Carver," she said, her tone measured. "But I believe this program isn't just an investment in our employees, it's an investment in the future of Harper Oil. A strong mentorship culture can help retain talent and improve morale, which ultimately benefits the company." Brian watched her closely, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Miss Collins is correct," he said, backing her up. "This program aligns with our commitment to fairness and growth. We're moving forward with it." Ms. Carver's expression tightened, but she said nothing further. Felicia's heart swelled with pride, knowing she had held her ground and earned Brian's trust once again. Outside of work, Felicia's life began to stabilize. With her new salary, she was able to pay off her mother's medical bills and move her into a better facility for care. The weight that had hung over her for so long was finally lifting. One evening, as Felicia visited her mother, she shared stories of her work and the changes happening at Harper Oil. Her mother, frail but alert, smiled warmly. "I'm so proud of you, Felicia," she said, squeezing her daughter's hand. "You've worked so hard, and now you're making a difference." Her mother's words reminded Felicia why she had fought so hard for this opportunity. It wasn't just about a paycheck. It was about proving to herself and others that integrity and perseverance mattered. Back at Harper Oil, Brian observed Felicia's growth with quiet pride. Her story had not only inspired him, but also reignited his faith in the company he had built. He began involving her in even more strategic decisions, mentoring her in areas like leadership and long-term planning. "You're not just part of this company's future, Felicia," Brian told her one day as they reviewed the latest employee satisfaction survey. "You're shaping it. Never underestimate the impact you're having." His words left a lasting impression on her. For the first time in her life, Felicia felt like she belonged, not just in her role, but in the larger purpose she was helping to achieve. Felicia's initiatives began to bear fruit. The mentorship program was launched successfully, connecting new hires with seasoned employees. Workplace morale improved, and the recruitment process became a model for fairness and transparency. Employees who once doubted the changes started to see their value, and even skeptics like Ms. Carver began to soften. Felicia knew the journey was far from over, but with Brian's guidance and her own growing confidence, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As Harper Oil and Energy continued to implement its sweeping reforms, Brian, Harper, and Felicia encountered their biggest challenge yet: resistance from key stakeholders. The company's new merit-based hiring practices, mentorship programs, and employee-focused initiatives had begun to improve morale internally. But externally, powerful shareholders who prioritized profits over ethics started to voice their displeasure. Brian sat at the head of the long, polished boardroom table. Across from him were the company's most influential shareholders, their expressions ranging from skeptical to outright hostile. Felicia was seated nearby, her presence in the meeting a deliberate decision by Brian. She was there to learn, but also to witness firsthand the challenges of driving change at the highest level. One of the shareholders, an imposing man named Mr. Grayson, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Brian. "While we appreciate the sentiment behind these reforms, Mr. Harper, we're concerned about the bottom line. These mentorship programs and restructuring efforts cost money. Money that could be better spent on expanding operations or increasing dividends." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Brian remained calm, his hands folded on the table. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Grayson," he replied evenly. "But let me assure you, these changes are not expenses, they're investments. By fostering a culture of fairness and integrity, we're attracting top talent and improving employee retention. In the long term, that will drive innovation and profitability." Grayson wasn't convinced. "And what about the perception of this company? These changes might be good PR, but we're an oil company, not a charity. I've received calls from investors who are worried we're losing focus on our core mission." Felicia's stomach tightened. She could feel the tension in the room and the weight of the moment. But Brian, ever composed, leaned forward slightly, his voice firm but measured. "Our core mission, Mr. Grayson, is not just to extract resources, it's to lead responsibly. The world is changing, and so are expectations for corporate behavior. If we fail to adapt, we risk losing our competitive edge." The room fell silent for a moment, the shareholders exchanging uneasy glances. Brian continued, "These reforms aren't about charity, they're about securing this company's future. And I intend to see them through." After the meeting, Brian and Felicia returned to his office. Brian leaned against the edge of his desk, his expression contemplative. "That was one of the tougher meetings we've had," he said, glancing at Felicia. Felicia nodded, still processing what she had witnessed. "They only see the short-term cost. They don't understand the bigger picture." Brian smiled faintly. "Exactly. Change always faces resistance, especially from those who fear it might disrupt their comfort or profits. That's why it's so important to stay the course." Felicia hesitated before speaking. "Do you think they'll try to block the reforms?" "They might," Brian admitted, "but we have the support of enough key players to push forward. And more importantly, the changes are already working. It's only a matter of time before the results speak for themselves." Felicia nodded, her determination renewed. "I'll do whatever I can to help." "I know you will," Brian said, his tone warm. "That's why I brought you into that meeting. You're part of this now, Felicia, both the successes and the challenges." While the board remained a looming challenge, resistance was also bubbling within the company. Some longtime employees resented the new merit-based systems, feeling their tenure should afford them certain privileges. Complaints began to surface, including accusations that the reforms unfairly prioritized new hires over established staff. One afternoon, Felicia received an anonymous email alleging favoritism in the mentorship program. The message accused her of playing favorites and undermining senior employees. She brought the email to Brian immediately, her hands shaking. I don't understand, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. I've been nothing but fair. Brian read the email carefully before setting it down. This isn't about you, Felicia. It's about fear. People fear change, especially when they feel it threatens their place in the hierarchy. What do we do? She asked. We stay transparent, Brian said. Address concerns openly. Invite feedback. But we don't compromise the integrity of these reforms. The moment we back down, we lose everything we're working for. Felicia nodded, her resolve hardening. I won't let this stop us. The challenges only strengthened Felicia's commitment to the reforms. She began holding regular town hall meetings with employees, giving them a platform to voice their concerns and ideas. Slowly, skepticism began to give way to understanding. Employees who had once resisted the changes started to see their benefits. Brian, meanwhile, continued to navigate the boardroom battles, using every ounce of his experience and influence to keep the reforms on track. Together, he and Felicia became a formidable team, their shared vision propelling Harper Oil toward a brighter future. Brian Harper sat in his office, the early morning light streaming through the large windows. His gaze was fixed on a spreadsheet detailing the company's latest performance metrics. Harper Oil was thriving, employee productivity was at an all-time high, turnover rates had dropped, and morale had surged across all departments. It was a testament to the sweeping changes the company had embraced over the past months. But his thoughts were not solely on the numbers. Brian had always been a planner, someone who looked years ahead. Now, as he neared 70, he knew the time was coming to make an important decision. Who would carry the company's legacy forward? Felicia entered his office later that morning, balancing a stack of reports in her arms. She had grown into her role with remarkable speed, her confidence shining through her every interaction. You wanted to see me, Mr. Harper? She asked, setting the reports on his desk. Brian gestured to the chair across from him. Yes, Felicia. Sit down. She complied, her curiosity piqued by the seriousness in his tone. Felicia, you've done extraordinary work here, he began, leaning forward. When I first met you in that waiting room, I saw something in you, something that's only grown stronger with time. You don't just do the job, you embody the values this company stands for. Felicia blinked, her cheeks flushing. Thank you, Mr. Harper. That means a lot coming from you. Brian nodded. I didn't call you here to praise you, though. I called you because I want to prepare you for something bigger. Much bigger. Felicia's breath caught. What do you mean? I'm not going to be in this seat forever, he said simply. When I step back, I need someone I trust to carry forward the vision we've built together. I believe you could be that person. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. You're saying you want me to lead Harper Oil? In time, yes, Brian said. But first, we need to ensure you're ready for that responsibility. Leadership isn't just about knowing the job. It's about understanding people, navigating challenges, and staying true to your principles, even when it's hard. Felicia swallowed hard, her mind racing. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything yet, Brian said with a faint smile. For now, I want you to shadow me more closely. Attend board meetings, work on strategic planning, and handle some of the more complex decisions with me. Think of it as mentorship, preparing you for the future. Felicia nodded slowly, the enormity of the opportunity sinking in. I won't let you down, Mr. Harper. I know you won't, he replied, his tone warm. That's why I chose you. The mentorship began immediately. Brian brought Felicia into high-stakes meetings, teaching her the art of negotiation and decision-making. One of her first tests came when a major client threatened to pull out of a lucrative partnership unless Harper Oil adjusted its pricing model. The issue was contentious, with strong opinions on both sides. Felicia spent hours reviewing the data, consulting with team members, and preparing a recommendation. When the time came to present her findings to Brian and the senior leadership team, she stood confidently at the head of the table. I believe we can retain this client without compromising our principles, she said, outlining her strategy. If we adjust pricing for long-term contracts while maintaining our ethical standards, we'll not only keep their business, but also demonstrate our commitment to fairness. Her presentation was met with nods of approval, and Brian beamed with pride. Excellent work, Felicia, he said. This is exactly the kind of leadership we need. That evening, as Felicia sat in her modest apartment, she reflected on how far she had come. From a desperate job applicant with nothing to her name to a trusted protege of one of the most respected CEOs in the industry, her journey had been nothing short of remarkable. Her phone buzzed, and she smiled as she saw her mother's name. Answering the call, she listened to her mother's cheerful voice. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Felicia's heart swelled. "It was amazing, Mom. I still can't believe I'm here sometimes, but I think I'm starting to find my place." "You've earned every bit of it," her mother replied warmly. "And I know you're going to do incredible things." Felicia smiled, her resolve strengthening. She didn't just want to prove herself to Brian or the company. She wanted to honor the sacrifices her mother had made to support her dreams. As she hung up the phone, Felicia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead would be challenging, but she was ready. With Brian's guidance, she would prepare herself for whatever the future held. Brian Harper sat in his office, the early morning light streaming through the large windows. His gaze was fixed on a spreadsheet detailing the company's latest performance metrics. Harper Oil was thriving, employee productivity was at an all-time high, turnover rates had dropped, and morale had surged across all departments. It was a testament to the sweeping changes the company had embraced over the past months. But his thoughts were not solely on the numbers. Brian had always been a planner, someone who looked years ahead. Now, as he neared 70, he knew the time was coming to make an important decision. Who would carry the company's legacy forward? Felicia entered his office later that morning, balancing a stack of reports in her arms. She had grown into her role with remarkable speed, her confidence shining through her every interaction. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Harper?" she asked, setting the reports on his desk. Brian gestured to the chair across from him. "Yes, Felicia. Sit down." She complied, her curiosity piqued by the seriousness in his tone. "Felicia, you've done extraordinary work here," he began, leaning forward. "When I first met you in that waiting room, I saw something in you, something that's only grown stronger with time. You don't just do the job, you embody the values this company stands for." Felicia blinked, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. That means a lot coming from you." Brian nodded. "I didn't call you here to praise you, though. I called you because I want to prepare you for something bigger. Much bigger." Felicia's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I'm not going to be in this seat forever," he said simply. "When I step back, I need someone I trust to carry forward the vision we've built together. I believe you could be that person." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. You're saying you want me to lead Harper Oil?" "In time, yes," Brian said. "But first, we need to ensure you're ready for that responsibility. Leadership isn't just about knowing the job. It's about understanding people, navigating challenges, and staying true to your principles even when it's hard." Felicia swallowed hard, her mind racing. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything yet," Brian said with a faint smile. "For now, I want you to shadow me more closely. Attend board meetings, work on strategic planning, and handle some of the more complex decisions with me. Think of it as mentorship preparing you for the future." Felicia nodded slowly, the enormity of the opportunity sinking in. "I won't let you down, Mr. Harper." "I know you won't," he replied, his tone warm. "That's why I chose you." The mentorship began immediately. Brian brought Felicia into high-stakes meetings, teaching her the art of negotiation and decision-making. One of her first tests came when a major client threatened to pull out of a lucrative partnership unless Harper Oil adjusted its pricing model. The issue was contentious, with strong opinions on both sides. Felicia spent hours reviewing the data, consulting with team members, and preparing a recommendation. When the time came to present her findings to Brian and the senior leadership team, she stood confidently at the head of the table. "I believe we can retain this client without compromising our principles," she said, outlining her strategy. "If we adjust pricing for long-term contracts while maintaining our ethical standards, we'll not only keep their business, but also demonstrate our commitment to fairness." Her presentation was met with nods of approval, and Brian beamed with pride. "Excellent work, Felicia," he said. "This is exactly the kind of leadership we need." That evening, as Felicia sat in her modest apartment, she reflected on how far she had come. From a desperate job applicant with nothing to her name, to a trusted protege of one of the most respected CEOs in the industry, her journey had been nothing short of remarkable. Her phone buzzed, and she smiled as she saw her mother's name. Answering the call, she listened to her mother's cheerful voice. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Felicia's heart swelled. "It was amazing, Mom. I still can't believe I'm here sometimes, but I think I'm starting to find my place." "You've earned every bit of it," her mother replied warmly. "And I know you're going to do incredible things." Felicia smiled, her resolve strengthening. She didn't just want to prove herself to Brian or the company. She wanted to honor the sacrifices her mother had made to support her dreams. As she hung up the phone, Felicia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead would be challenging, but she was ready. With Brian's guidance, she would prepare herself for whatever the future held. Felicia's new role as Brian Harper's protege brought with it not only opportunities but also a fresh wave of challenges. She was now a visible figure in Harper Oil, attending high-profile meetings, leading initiatives, and making decisions that carried significant weight. Her every move was watched, scrutinized by colleagues and shareholders alike. The first major challenge came during a quarterly shareholders meeting. Felicia, sitting beside Brian, felt the weight of the room's attention on her. While Brian's support was steadfast, there were still those who questioned her rapid rise within the company. Mr. Grayson, the most outspoken critic among the shareholders, addressed the room, his tone skeptical. "Mr. Harper, while we all respect the reforms you've implemented, I must ask, how can someone with such limited experience take on such a pivotal role? Surely, we need someone with more years in the industry to guide this company." The question was a thinly veiled attack on Felicia, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Felicia glanced at Brian, who gave her a slight nod, encouraging her to respond. Straightening in her chair, Felicia met Grayson's gaze. "Experience is valuable, Mr. Grayson, but it's not the only measure of a person's ability to lead. I may not have decades in the industry, but I've immersed myself in every aspect of this company since I arrived. I've worked with employees at all levels from the ground up, and I've learned that leadership is about listening, adapting, and staying true to your principles. That's what Harper Oil stands for." Grayson's expression hardened, but murmurs of approval rippled through the room. Brian stepped in to reinforce her point. "Felicia's insight and contributions have already led to measurable improvements in our operations. Her perspective is exactly what this company needs to stay innovative and forward-thinking." The moment passed, and the meeting moved on, but Felicia's heart raced. She had faced one of her toughest critics and held her ground, earning silent nods of approval from other shareholders. A few weeks later, Felicia was faced with an ethical dilemma that tested her resolve. A supplier approached her with a lucrative proposal, offering discounted rates in exchange for a long-term exclusive contract. On the surface, the deal seemed beneficial, but upon closer inspection, Felicia discovered that the supplier had a history of questionable labor practices. Felicia brought the matter to Brian, outlining the risks. "We can't align ourselves with a company that exploits its workers," she said firmly. "It goes against everything we're trying to build." Brian nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, but rejecting this deal will cost us financially. Are you prepared to defend that decision?" Felicia's resolve didn't waver. "Yes, if we compromise our values now, we'll lose the trust of our employees and partners. The cost would be far greater in the long run." Brian smiled, his pride evident. "Then we reject the deal." When the supplier was informed of the decision, Felicia stood firm despite their protests. The news spread throughout the company, reinforcing Harper Oil's commitment to ethical practices. Employees, inspired by Felicia's leadership, rallied behind the decision. As the weeks passed, Felicia's reputation continued to grow. Employees across departments began seeking her guidance, viewing her as a symbol of fairness and integrity. She was invited to lead training sessions on ethical decision-making and workplace culture, her influence extending beyond her initial role. Even her most vocal critics began to soften. One afternoon, Ms. Carver approached Felicia in the break room, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Here," she said, handing one to Felicia. "I owe you an apology." Felicia blinked, surprised. For what? For doubting you, Ms. Carver admitted. I was wrong. You've proven yourself, and I'm glad you're here. Felicia smiled, accepting the coffee. Thank you. That means a lot. Brian, watching Felicia's growth, began to finalize his plans for the company's future. He had long considered stepping back from his role as CEO, and now, for the first time, he felt confident that Harper Oil would be in good hands. Felicia had not only exceeded his expectations, but had also won the respect of the company, paving the way for the next chapter. As Felicia stood on the precipice of even greater responsibilities, she felt ready. Her journey had been anything but easy, but every challenge had shaped her into the leader Brian had seen in her from the beginning. Brian Harper sat in his private office, gazing out at the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting golden hues across the glass towers. It was a fitting metaphor, he thought. He was approaching the twilight of his career, and the time had come to pass the torch to someone capable of carrying his vision forward. Felicia Collins was that person. Over the past months, she had proven herself not only as a competent leader but as someone who embodied the principles Harper Oil stood for: fairness, integrity, and a relentless pursuit of excellence. Now it was time to prepare her for an even greater role. Felicia, can you join me in my office? Brian called her over the intercom. A few moments later, Felicia walked in, her notepad in hand. Yes, Mr. Harper? She asked, her expression curious. Brian gestured for her to sit. We need to have an important conversation, he said. His tone was calm, but carried the weight of something significant. Felicia sat, her heart beginning to race. Is something wrong? She asked cautiously. Brian smiled. Quite the opposite. Felicia, you've become an integral part of this company. You've not only helped implement the reforms, but also inspired the people around you. That's a rare quality. Felicia's cheeks flushed. Thank you, Mr. Harper. I've just been doing what I felt was right, and that's precisely why I'm having this conversation with you, Brian said. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. I've decided to step back from my role as CEO within the next year. Felicia's eyes widened. You're stepping down? Yes, Brian confirmed. It's a decision I've been considering for a while. The company is in a good place now, and I believe it's time for new leadership. Leadership that reflects the future of Harper Oil. Felicia's heart pounded. And you think? I know you're ready for this, Brian said, cutting her off gently. But this isn't something that happens overnight. The next year will be about preparing you, ensuring you're fully equipped to lead this company. You'll work closely with me on all executive decisions, attend every board meeting, and be involved in shaping the strategic direction of Harper Oil. Felicia sat back, the weight of his words sinking in. I don't know if I'm ready for something this big. Brian's smile was reassuring. You're more ready than you think, and I'll be here every step of the way to guide you. That evening, Felicia sat in her apartment, staring at the skyline from her window. The magnitude of what Brian had proposed was overwhelming. She thought about her journey from struggling to pay her mother's hospital bills to now being groomed to lead one of the world's largest energy companies. Doubt crept into her mind. Could she truly rise to this challenge? What if she failed? Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. You've worked so hard, Felicia. Don't let anyone make you think you're not good enough. She closed her eyes, exhaling deeply. I can do this, she whispered to herself. I have to. The next morning, Felicia walked into Brian's office, her resolve firm. I'm ready, she said simply. Brian looked up from his papers, a knowing smile on his face. Good. Let's get started. Over the next weeks, Felicia shadowed Brian more closely than ever. She joined him in high-level meetings with stakeholders, learned the intricacies of financial planning, and tackled complex decisions under his watchful eye. With each passing day, her confidence grew. One of Felicia's biggest hurdles was gaining the full support of the board. While many had warmed to her, a few, including Mr. Grayson, remained skeptical. Brian saw this as an opportunity to prove her mettle. During a critical board meeting about a potential expansion project, Brian stepped back, allowing Felicia to take the lead. She presented a detailed analysis of the project, outlining its risks and rewards with precision. When Mr. Grayson raised concerns, Felicia addressed them head-on, using data to support her points. By the end of the meeting, even Grayson had to admit she had handled herself with poise and expertise. As the board members filed out, Brian clapped Felicia on the shoulder. "You're doing great," he said. "Keep this up and they'll be fully on your side in no time." In the months that followed, Felicia and Brian worked together to refine Harper Oil's long-term strategy. They introduced initiatives aimed at sustainability, corporate responsibility, and technological innovation. Felicia's fresh perspective complemented Brian's experience, creating a powerful synergy. Employees began to see Felicia not just as a rising star, but as a leader in her own right. Her reputation for fairness and approachability made her a trusted figure within the company, while her sharp mind and unwavering resolve earned the respect of the leadership team. As the months progressed, Felicia became more entrenched in her role as Brian Harper's protege. Her growing responsibilities brought new challenges, but she thrived under Brian's mentorship. The board members, employees, and even skeptics like Mr. Grayson began to acknowledge her capability and vision for Harper Oil. But just as the transition seemed to be unfolding smoothly, Felicia encountered her first major crisis, a test that would determine not only her readiness to lead, but also the resilience of Harper Oil's new values. It began with a late-night email from one of Harper Oil's overseas subsidiaries. Felicia was in her apartment, going over notes from a meeting when the notification appeared on her screen. Opening the email, she read the grim details. The subsidiary was accused of environmental violations at one of its drilling sites, and a prominent environmental organization was threatening legal action and a public campaign against the company. Her heart sank. The accusations, if true, could tarnish everything Harper Oil had worked to rebuild. The reforms that she and Brian had championed would be questioned, and the company's reputation, both internally and externally, would be at risk. Felicia immediately called Brian. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm but serious as she explained the situation. "This is a critical moment, Felicia," he said after listening. "How we handle this will define not just your leadership, but the future of Harper Oil. Meet me at the office first thing in the morning. We need a plan." The next morning, Felicia stood at the head of the conference table in the crisis management room, addressing key executives and legal advisors. Brian sat at her side but allowed her to take the lead, observing how she managed the situation. "We have to act swiftly and transparently," Felicia began. "First, we need to investigate the allegations thoroughly. If violations occurred, we must take responsibility and implement corrective actions immediately." The head of legal raised an eyebrow. "Admitting fault could open us up to lawsuits. Failing to address the issue honestly will destroy the trust we've worked so hard to build," Felicia countered. "Our integrity has to come first." Another executive chimed in. "And the media? They're already running with this story. We need a strategy to manage public perception." Felicia nodded. "I'll draft a statement for the press, emphasizing our commitment to accountability and environmental responsibility. But our actions will speak louder than words. We'll pause operations at the site until we complete our investigation and address any issues." Brian leaned forward, his expression approving. "What about the employees at the subsidiary? How will we ensure this doesn't happen again?" Felicia turned to him, her voice steady. "We'll conduct mandatory training on environmental compliance and ethics across all subsidiaries. And I suggest we appoint an independent auditor to monitor our practices globally." Hours later, Felicia stood at a podium in Harper Oil's press room, cameras flashing as reporters fired questions. She remained composed, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the issue. "We take these allegations seriously," she said. "Harper Oil is committed to operating with integrity and accountability. We have launched an independent investigation and will take immediate corrective actions if violations are confirmed. This company stands by its responsibility to the environment and the communities we serve." Her statement was measured but firm, striking a balance between accountability and reassurance. The media's coverage of her response was largely positive, with many praising the company's transparency. Over the next few weeks, Felicia worked tirelessly to ensure the subsidiary implemented the necessary changes. The investigation confirmed that violations had occurred, and Felicia personally oversaw the development of an action plan to address them. Harper Oil compensated affected communities and implemented stricter environmental safeguards. The crisis gradually subsided, and the company's response won praise from environmental groups and industry leaders. Employees, inspired by Felicia's leadership, rallied behind her, proud to be part of a company that prioritized integrity over damage control. After the dust settled, Brian invited Felicia to his office. He stood by the window, gazing out at the skyline as she entered. "You handled that brilliantly," he said, turning to face her. "Crises like this are what separate good leaders from great ones. You didn't just protect the company, you reinforced its values." Felicia smiled, relief washing over her. "I couldn't have done it without your guidance." Brian shook his head. "You made the decisions. You took the responsibility, and you proved that you're ready." By the end of the chapter, Harper Oil had emerged from the crisis stronger than before. Felicia's handling of the situation solidified her position as a leader and reinforced the company's commitment to ethics and accountability. Felicia stood in her office one evening, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of her mother's unwavering belief in her, Brian's mentorship, and the challenges that had tested her at every step. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but she also knew she was ready for whatever came next. As the crisis faded into the rear-view mirror, Harper Oil and Energy found itself on stable ground once again. Felicia Collins had proven her mettle, emerging as the face of a company in transition. Her handling of the environmental scandal had not only reinforced the company's values, but also cemented her status as Brian Harper's heir apparent. Now, the focus shifted to preparing for her eventual appointment as CEO. Brian invited Felicia to his office for one of their regular mentoring sessions. As always, his presence was both calming and commanding. This time, however, the air was different. He seemed reflective, almost sentimental. "Felicia," he began, leaning back in his chair, "the board is ready to discuss the transition. They've seen enough to trust you, and I think it's time we formalize the plan." Felicia swallowed hard. "You mean setting a date for me to take over?" "Yes," Brian said with a nod. "But there's more to this than just taking the title. I want you to understand the weight of this role. As CEO, every decision you make, every word you say, will ripple through this company and beyond. Are you ready for that responsibility?" Felicia hesitated but then nodded. "I've had doubts along the way, but I believe in what we're building here. I'm ready to carry that forward." Brian smiled, his expression warm. "Good. Over the next few months, we'll announce the transition, prepare the board and staff, and ensure you have everything you need to succeed. This company will be in excellent hands." While most board members had warmed to Felicia, there were still a few skeptics, particularly Mr. Grayson. Brian arranged a private meeting between Felicia and the remaining doubters, giving her the chance to present her vision for Harper Oil's future. Standing in the sleek boardroom, Felicia faced the group with confidence. She had spent days preparing, and it showed in her polished presentation. "My vision for Harper Oil isn't just about profitability," she began. "It's about sustainability, innovation, and integrity. We've shown that these values can coexist with financial success, and I intend to build on that foundation." She outlined her plans for expanding the company's renewable energy initiatives, improving global compliance, and fostering innovation through employee empowerment. Her arguments were compelling, backed by data and real-world results from the reforms she had already helped implement. By the end of the meeting, even Mr. Grayson had softened. "I'll admit, I wasn't sure about you, Miss Collins," he said, "but you've proven me wrong. You've earned my support." The official announcement came at a company-wide event, where Brian and Felicia stood together on stage before hundreds of employees. Brian, as always, spoke with authority and pride. "It's been my honor to lead this company for many years," he said. "But every leader must know when it's time to step back and make way for the future. Felicia Collins represents that future. Her vision, integrity, and leadership have already transformed Harper Oil, and I have no doubt she will lead this company to even greater heights. The applause was thunderous as Brian stepped aside to let Felicia speak. She took a deep breath, scanning the crowd. This company has always stood for excellence, she began. But excellence isn't just about profits or production, it's about people. It's about creating an environment where everyone, from the janitor to the CEO, feels valued and empowered. Together, we will build a future that we can all be proud of. The standing ovation that followed was a testament to the trust and respect Felicia had earned. After the event, Brian and Felicia retreated to his office for a quiet moment. Brian poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed one to her. "You did well today," he said, raising his glass in a toast. "To your future as CEO." Felicia smiled, clinking her glass against his. "To everything you've taught me." Brian shook his head. "You already had everything you needed. Felicia, all I did was help you see it." As they sat in silence, watching the city lights flicker outside the window, Felicia felt a sense of calm and determination. She wasn't just stepping into a role, she was stepping into her destiny. The transition was in full swing, and Harper Oil buzzed with anticipation. Employees were still talking about the announcement, and Felicia Collins had become the center of attention within the company. She balanced her new responsibilities with her ongoing mentorship under Brian Harper, preparing for her first day as CEO. One morning, Felicia arrived to find her new office being prepared. Located on the top floor, it was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a stunning view of the city skyline. The desk was already set up, and a large conference table occupied one corner of the room. A team of designers waited to finalize the decor based on her preferences. Mike, who had been one of her strongest supporters, joined her in the room. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing to the space. "It's beautiful," Felicia said, running her fingers over the polished wood of the desk. "But it also feels overwhelming." Mike chuckled. "It's just an office, Felicia. What you bring to it is what matters." Felicia smiled, his words reassuring her. "I suppose you're right." Brian had chosen to deliver a farewell address to the company before officially stepping down. It was an emotional event bringing together employees from all departments. Brian stood before the crowd, his voice steady as he spoke about his journey and the future of Harper Oil. "When I started this company, I dreamed of building something that would outlast me," he said. "And today, I can say with confidence that we're not just leaving behind a legacy, we're building a future." Felicia Collins embodies that future. She has shown us what integrity and vision look like in action, and I know she will lead us to even greater success. The applause was deafening. Brian stepped back, his face calm but emotional, as Felicia approached the podium. Taking a deep breath, Felicia addressed the crowd. "When I first walked into Harper Oil, I was just another applicant hoping for a chance. I couldn't have imagined that I'd one day stand here as your next CEO. This company has given me opportunities one never thought possible, and I am honored to carry forward the vision that Mr. Harper has built." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Our future is one of innovation, sustainability, and integrity. Together, we will not only meet the challenges ahead, but redefine what success looks like. Thank you for trusting me, and I look forward to working with each of you to achieve greatness." The room erupted into applause, employees standing to cheer her on. Brian smiled from the sidelines, knowing he had made the right choice. Later that evening, Felicia returned to her modest apartment. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights. Her thoughts drifted to her mother, who had always believed in her. She picked up her phone and dialed. "Mom," she said when her mother answered. "It's official. I'm going to be CEO." Her mother's voice was warm with pride. "I knew you would be. You've always had the strength and heart to do great things." Felicia smiled, her eyes misting. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You've earned this, sweetheart," her mother replied. "Now go and show the world what you're capable of." As Felicia ended the call, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her journey had been long and challenging, but she was ready for the next chapter. The next day, Felicia met Brian in his office for one last conversation before his departure. The room was nearly empty, his belongings packed into boxes. "You're ready," Brian said simply, handing her a folder containing the final documents for the transition. "Trust your instincts, Felicia. You've proven time and again that you have what it takes." "I'll do my best," she said, her voice steady. Brian smiled. "Your best will be more than enough." They shook hands, and for the first time, Felicia felt the full weight and pride of what lay ahead. The sun rose on a new chapter for Harper Oil and Energy. Felicia Collins stood in her apartment, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, her shoulders squared and her chin lifted, she looked every inch the CEO she was about to become. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, she felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. "This is it," she murmured to herself. "Everything I've worked for starts today." When Felicia arrived at the Harper Oil headquarters, the energy was palpable. Employees lined the main lobby, clapping as she entered. She smiled warmly, pausing to shake hands and exchange greetings. The applause felt surreal, but it also reinforced the gravity of her new role. Mike was waiting for her near the elevators, grinning broadly. "Ready to make history?" he asked. Felicia chuckled, her nerves easing slightly. "No pressure, right?" "None at all," Mike replied with a wink. "You've got this." As they rode the elevator to the executive floor, Felicia mentally reviewed her schedule. The day would begin with a meeting of department heads, followed by a series of strategic planning sessions. She knew all eyes would be on her, judging her every decision. The boardroom was filled with familiar faces when Felicia walked in, but the atmosphere was different. She was no longer Brian Harper's protege, she was the CEO. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "Thank you for being here. I want to start by saying that I'm honored to lead Harper Oil. Together, we've built something incredible, and I'm excited to work with all of you to take it even further." The department heads nodded, their expressions ranging from supportive to cautiously optimistic. Felicia quickly shifted to the agenda, outlining her priorities for the company's next quarter. She emphasized 3 key goals: expanding renewable energy initiatives, strengthening community partnerships, and driving innovation through employee empowerment. "These aren't just business objectives," she said. "They're the foundation of who we are as a company." As the meeting progressed, Felicia fielded questions with confidence. When Mr. Grayson raised a concern about the cost of renewable energy projects, she addressed it head-on. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Grayson," she said, "but the world is moving toward cleaner energy and so must we. By investing now, we position ourselves as leaders in a growing market. It's a strategic move, not just a moral one." Her response earned nods of approval, even from skeptics. By the end of the meeting, Felicia felt a sense of accomplishment. She had taken her first steps as CEO and earned the respect of her team. The rest of the day brought its own challenges. Felicia had to make tough calls on budget allocations, mediate a disagreement between 2 department heads, and approve a new marketing strategy. Each decision required careful thought and collaboration, but she handled them with poise. During a break, Mike stopped by her office. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Felicia smiled. "It's a lot, but I'm managing." "You're doing more than managing," Mike said. "You're leading." As the day wound down, Felicia found herself alone in her new office. The city lights sparkled outside the window, reminder of the world she was now responsible for influencing. She leaned back in her chair, replaying the events of the day in her mind. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brian. "How was your first day, Madam CEO?" Felicia smiled and typed back, challenging but rewarding, "Thank you for everything." Brian's reply came quickly. "The company is in good hands. Keep trusting yourself." As she put down the phone, Felicia allowed herself a moment of pride. The journey ahead would be demanding, but she was ready. She wasn't just filling Brian Harper's shoes, she was creating her own path, one decision at a time. Felicia's second week as CEO began with a sense of purpose. While the transition had been smooth so far, she knew that her first company-wide initiative as CEO would set the tone for her leadership. She had been quietly planning a major project for weeks, one that would both honor Harper Oil's legacy and push the company toward its future. The launch of Harper Renewables, a division dedicated to clean energy innovation. During a strategy meeting with senior executives, Felicia outlined her ambitious vision. Harper Renewables would focus on research and development of sustainable energy solutions such as solar, wind, and biofuels, alongside initiatives to reduce the company's carbon footprint. This isn't just about staying competitive, Felicia said, addressing the room. It's about leading the way. We have the resources, the talent, and the platform to make a real difference in the energy industry. This is our chance to be pioneers. The proposal was met with mixed reactions. While some executives were enthusiastic, others expressed concerns about the cost and potential risks. Mr. Grayson, as always, was the most vocal skeptic. "Miss Collins," he said, his tone measured, "Harper Oil has always been a leader in traditional energy. Shifting resources toward renewables could dilute our focus and affect our bottom line. Are you prepared for that?" Felicia met his gaze evenly. "I'm prepared for the challenges, yes. But I believe the long-term benefits outweigh the short-term costs. The energy industry is changing, and if we don't adapt, we'll be left behind." Brian, who was attending the meeting as an advisor, spoke up in her defense. "I agree with Felicia. This is a bold move, but bold moves are what built this company. I trust her judgment." With Brian's endorsement and Felicia's compelling vision, the board ultimately approved the project. Harper Renewables was officially greenlit. Felicia wasted no time assembling a team to lead the new division. She hand-picked individuals from various departments, prioritizing not just technical expertise, but also passion for innovation and sustainability. Luis, the former janitor turned logistics coordinator, was among those selected, a decision that inspired employees across the company. "I never thought I'd be part of something like this," Luis said during a team meeting. "Thank you for believing in me." Felicia smiled. "You've earned it, Luis. Now, let's show the world what we can do." The project kicked off with a company-wide announcement. Felicia addressed employees through a live-streamed event, standing in front of a banner that read Harper Renewables, powering the future. "This isn't just about creating a new division," she said. "It's about redefining who we are and what we stand for. Harper Oil has always been a leader in energy. Now, we're taking that leadership into a new era, one that prioritizes innovation, sustainability, and responsibility." Her speech was met with widespread support. Employees across departments volunteered to contribute to the initiative, and morale soared as Harper Renewables became a source of pride. Despite the enthusiasm, challenges quickly arose. The initial phase of the project faced delays due to supply chain issues and technical setbacks. Critics in the media questioned whether Harper Oil was capable of succeeding in the renewable energy space, and shareholders grew anxious. Felicia worked tirelessly to address the issues, holding late-night meetings with her team and negotiating directly with suppliers to resolve bottlenecks. Her hands-on approach earned her respect, but the pressure was relentless. During one particularly tough day, Mike stopped by her office with a cup of coffee. "You look like you haven't slept in days," he said, setting the cup on her desk. Felicia chuckled weakly. "Because I haven't. This project feels like a mountain, and I'm not sure we're moving fast enough." Mike leaned against her desk, his expression reassuring. "Mountains aren't climbed in a day. You're doing great, and everyone sees it. Keep going." After weeks of setbacks, the team finally achieved a major milestone: the successful launch of a pilot project integrating solar energy into one of Harper Oil's largest facilities. The achievement was celebrated company-wide, with employees and media outlets applauding the move as a step toward a sustainable future. Felicia stood with her team at the facility's ribbon-cutting ceremony, her heart swelling with pride. As she addressed the crowd, she said, "This is just the beginning. Harper Renewables is more than a project, it's a promise to lead, innovate, and inspire." Watching the ceremony from the sidelines, Brian Harper felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Felicia's leadership had not only validated his decision to step down, but also reaffirmed his belief in the company's potential to evolve. As the crowd dispersed, he approached Felicia and said, "You've made me proud. This company is lucky to have you." Felicia smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. I couldn't have done this without you, Brian. Thank you for believing in me. With the successful launch of the Harper Renewables division, Felicia Collins cemented her leadership vision for Harper Oil and Energy. The pilot project's success sparked excitement throughout the company and the energy sector. Employees felt invigorated, shareholders grew cautiously optimistic, and media outlets hailed the move as bold and forward-thinking. However, Felicia knew this was only the beginning. Sustaining and scaling the initiative would be the true test of her leadership. One morning, Felicia convened her team in the executive conference room. The agenda: expand Harper Renewables from a pilot project to a fully operational division integrated across multiple sites. Engineers, environmental experts, and financial analysts filled the room, each eager to contribute to the next phase. Felicia stood at the head of the table, her tone firm but enthusiastic. Our goal isn't just to dabble in renewables, she began. It's to become leaders in this space. We'll expand our solar integration projects, invest in wind and biofuel technologies, and partner with communities to implement sustainable energy solutions. Luis, now an integral part of the logistics team for Harper Renewables, raised his hand. How do we ensure the communities we work with are part of the decision-making process? Felicia smiled. Great question, Luis. We'll form community advisory boards for every project. These boards will help us understand local needs and ensure our solutions benefit everyone involved. The room buzzed with approval, and plans were set in motion to scale the division. Expanding Harper Renewables came with its own set of challenges: securing funding, navigating government regulations, and addressing internal resistance from employees who were skeptical about the shift in focus required Felicia's full attention. At one point, a senior financial officer expressed concerns during a strategy meeting. If we invest too heavily in renewables, we risk underfunding our traditional energy operations. That could hurt our bottom line. Felicia nodded, acknowledging the concern. It's a delicate balance, she admitted, but diversification is key to our long-term survival. The energy market is changing, and if we don't adapt now, we'll be left behind. By investing in both traditional and renewable energy, we secure our position as industry leaders. Her clear, pragmatic approach won over even the skeptics. One of the first large-scale renewable projects was a wind farm built in partnership with a rural community that had struggled with unreliable energy access. Felicia personally visited the site during its groundbreaking ceremony. Standing before a crowd of local residents, she spoke passionately about the project's potential. This wind farm isn't just about energy, she said. It's about creating jobs, empowering communities, and proving that innovation and responsibility go hand in hand. Together, we're building a better future. Her words resonated deeply, and the project became a symbol of Harper Oil's commitment to both sustainability and social responsibility. As Harper Renewables grew, so did its impact. The company's reputation transformed, attracting top talent from across the industry and forging new partnerships with innovative startups. Media outlets praised Felicia's leadership, calling her a trailblazer in the energy sector. One evening, Felicia sat in her office reviewing reports when Mike stopped by. "Have you seen this?" he asked, handing her a magazine. The cover featured Felicia's photo under the headline, "The CEO Leading the Energy Revolution." Felicia chuckled, setting the magazine aside. "It's not just me, Mike. It's everyone in this company. We've done this together." Mike smiled. "Maybe, but you've inspired everyone to believe it's possible. That's leadership." Brian Harper, now retired but still a trusted advisor to Felicia, watched the company's transformation with pride. During one of their regular lunches, he told her, "You've taken Harper Oil further than I ever imagined. You've not only protected the company's legacy, but reshaped it into something even greater." Felicia looked at him, her expression earnest. "I couldn't have done it without the foundation you built. You showed me what integrity in leadership looks like." Brian shook his head. "You've taken that integrity and turned it into action. That's what makes you a true leader." As Felicia prepared for the next phase of the company's evolution, she reflected on how far she had come. Her journey from a struggling job applicant to the CEO of a global energy leader was a testament to resilience, vision, and the power of doing what's right. With Harper Renewables firmly established in the domestic market, Felicia Collins set her sights on international expansion. The company had already garnered global attention for its renewable energy initiatives, and the time had come to take the Harper Oil legacy beyond its traditional borders. The goal was ambitious: to launch projects in regions that needed renewable energy the most, while navigating the complexities of international regulations and partnerships. Felicia convened a special meeting with her senior leadership team to unveil the international expansion strategy. Maps and charts filled the conference room, showcasing potential regions for solar, wind, and biofuel projects. She stood at the head of the table, her voice steady but brimming with enthusiasm. "Our work in renewables has transformed Harper Oil here at home," she began, "but there are communities around the world that lack reliable access to energy. This is our chance to make a global impact while expanding our market reach. We'll focus on regions with high renewable potential, such as Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of South America." Luis, now a senior member of Harper Renewables, raised a point. "How do we ensure that we respect local cultures and regulations while working in these regions?" Felicia nodded. "Excellent question. Every project will include partnerships with local governments, businesses, and community leaders. We'll also prioritize hiring local talent and using local resources to ensure the benefits stay within the communities." The room buzzed with excitement as Felicia outlined the next steps, assigning teams to research and initiate partnerships in key regions. The first major hurdle was forging partnerships with governments and organizations in the target regions. Felicia personally led negotiations with leaders in Kenya for a large-scale solar farm that would bring electricity to rural areas. The discussions were intense, with local officials concerned about the potential environmental and social impacts. During one meeting in Nairobi, Felicia addressed their concerns head-on. "Our goal isn't just to build a project, it's to create a partnership that benefits everyone. We're committed to transparency, sustainability, and respecting your needs. This isn't just about business. It's about empowering communities." Her sincerity won over the officials, and the partnership was finalized. The announcement of the project made headlines, positioning Harper Oil as a leader in renewable energy development in Africa. The global expansion wasn't without its challenges. In South America, Harper Oil faced resistance from environmental groups concerned about potential impacts on fragile ecosystems. Felicia instructed her team to engage with these groups, incorporating their feedback into the project plans. "Transparency is key," she told her leadership team. "If we're truly committed to sustainability, we must be willing to listen and adapt." This approach helped resolve tensions and earned the company respect from its critics. However, the process delayed the project's timeline, testing Felicia's patience and resolve. Despite the challenges, the projects began to take shape. The solar farm in Kenya became operational ahead of schedule, providing electricity to thousands of households and creating jobs for the local community. In Southeast Asia, Harper Oil launched a wind energy initiative that supplied clean power to remote villages. These successes bolstered the company's reputation as a global leader in renewable energy. At an international energy summit in Geneva, Felicia was invited to deliver a keynote address. Standing before an audience of global leaders and industry pioneers, she spoke passionately about the role of corporations in driving sustainable development. "The future of energy lies in our ability to innovate responsibly," she said. "As leaders, we have a choice to continue the status quo or to create a legacy of progress and sustainability. At Harper Oil, we've chosen the latter." Her speech received a standing ovation, and Harper Oil gained new allies and partnerships on the global stage. Brian Harper, watching from afar, felt immense pride in Felicia's accomplishments. During one of their regular calls, he said, "You've taken this company to places I never imagined. What you're doing isn't just business, it's history." Felicia smiled. "None of this would have been possible without the foundation you built. And none of it would have happened without your vision," Brian replied. You've made Harper Oil a force for good in the world. By the end of the chapter, Harper Oil's international projects had brought renewable energy to millions, transformed communities, and solidified the company's position as a global leader in sustainable energy. Felicia's leadership was praised worldwide, and employees felt a renewed sense of purpose and pride. As she reflected on the journey so far, Felicia knew there were still challenges ahead. But with each milestone, she grew more confident in the legacy she was building, not just for Harper Oil, but for the world. As Harper Oil's transformation neared its apex, the company stood as a global beacon of innovation and sustainability. Felicia Collins had led it through some of its most challenging yet rewarding years, and her leadership was reshaping not only the energy industry, but also the lives of millions across the globe. Felicia sat in her office one quiet evening, the city lights twinkling outside her window. Her desk was covered with reports and updates from Harper Renewable's latest projects, each one a testament to how far the company had come. She paused, allowing herself a rare moment of reflection. From a desperate job applicant defending a stranger in tattered clothes to the CEO of a global energy giant, her journey had been extraordinary. She thought of her mother, who had always believed in her, and of Brian Harper, who had given her the chance of a lifetime. Her phone buzzed, and she smiled as she saw a message from Brian. "Proud of you as always. Let's catch up soon." Felicia replied, "Wouldn't be here without you. Lunch next week." The next day, Harper Oil held its annual corporate event, a celebration of its achievements and the people who made them possible. The Grand Hall was filled with employees, partners, and dignitaries from around the world. Displays highlighted Harper Renewables projects, the solar farm in Kenya, the wind energy initiative in Southeast Asia, and the biofuel research breakthroughs in South America. Felicia took the stage to address the crowd. The room fell silent as she stood at the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. "When I first joined Harper Oil," she began, her voice steady, "I never imagined I'd be standing here today. But what I've learned is that leadership isn't about where you come from, it's about where you want to go and who you bring along with you." She paused, letting her words sink in. Harper Oil's journey is far from over. Together, we've proven that innovation, sustainability, and integrity can coexist. We've brought light to communities that once lived in darkness, and we've shown the world that a company can be a force for good. The room erupted into applause, and Felicia stepped back, her heart swelling with pride. After the event, Felicia met with Luis, who had become a close colleague and friend. He handed her a small envelope. "A little something from the renewables team," he said, grinning. Felicia opened it to find a handwritten letter of appreciation, signed by employees across the division. Tears pricked her eyes as she read the heartfelt messages, each one thanking her for her leadership and vision. "This means more to me than any award," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Later that week, Brian visited Felicia at her office. The two shared a warm hug before sitting down for what had become their regular lunch chats. "You've built something remarkable," Brian said, looking around the office that had once been his. "I always knew you had it in you." Felicia smiled. "You taught me to see the bigger picture, to focus on values as much as results. Everything we've done here is a reflection of that." Brian raised his glass of sparkling water. "To the future of Harper Oil, and to you, Felicia, the best decision I ever made." As the chapter closed, Felicia found herself looking not just at Harper Oil's accomplishments, but at its potential. She knew challenges would continue to arise, new markets to explore, new technologies to develop, and new partnerships to forge. But she was ready. Standing in her office that evening, she gazed at the horizon. Her journey was far from over, and neither was Harper Oil's. Together, they were building a legacy that would endure for generations. The years of transformation had reshaped Harper Oil and energy into a global leader in sustainability and innovation. Under Felicia Collins' leadership, the company had not only embraced renewable energy, but had become a model of corporate responsibility and ethical leadership. Now, standing at the pinnacle of her journey, Felicia reflected on the path that had brought her here. Felicia sat at the head of a long conference table in the boardroom, surrounded by her leadership team. This meeting wasn't about solving a crisis or launching a new initiative. It was a celebration of their shared success. Each department head presented their achievements over the past year, from new renewable projects to record-breaking community outreach programs. Luis, now a senior director in Harper Renewables, presented the latest figures. Our projects have brought clean energy to over 5 million people globally, he said with pride. And we're just getting started. The room broke into applause. Felicia smiled, her heart full. Thank you, Luis, and thank you to everyone here. This isn't just about numbers. It's about the lives we've touched and the future we're building together. Harper Oil's journey isn't about following trends. It's about leading with purpose. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. You've all made that possible. And for that, I'm deeply grateful. After the meeting, Felicia decided to visit a place she hadn't been in years, the entrance of Harper Oil's headquarters, where her journey had begun. She stood quietly by the gates, remembering the day she had sat in the waiting room as a hopeful applicant, her life in turmoil. It was here that she had defended a man dressed in rags, unaware he was Brian Harper, the CEO who would change her life forever. A security guard approached her, hesitant. "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" Felicia turned and smiled. "No, thank you. I was just remembering how far we've come." The guard looked puzzled but nodded, sensing her sincerity. Later that evening, Felicia met Brian for dinner at a quiet restaurant. He looked healthy and content in his retirement, though his eyes still held the sharpness of a man who had built an empire. "You've surpassed every expectation I had," he said, raising his glass to her. "And I had very high expectations." Felicia chuckled. "You always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." "That's because I saw what you couldn't yet see," Brian replied. "You've done more than lead this company. You've given it a soul." Felicia looked thoughtful. "Do you ever regret stepping down?" "Not for a second," Brian said. "Harper Oil is thriving, and the world is better for it. That's what matters." The next day, Felicia stood on stage at an industry conference, delivering a keynote address about Harper Oil's journey. Leaders from around the world listened intently as she spoke about the power of ethical leadership and the need for businesses to embrace change. As leaders, we have a responsibility not just to succeed, but to leave the world better than we found it, she said. At Harper Oil, we've learned that true progress comes from balancing innovation with integrity and profitability with purpose. The audience erupted in applause, a standing ovation that echoed long after she left the stage. That evening, back in her office, Felicia gazed out at the skyline. She thought of her mother, who had passed away peacefully the previous year, knowing her daughter had achieved